This is the Agricultural Order 4.0 Introduction Workshop. This and one additional workshop will be conducted in English. And we're also conducting the same workshop in Spanish and Mandarin for non-English speaking interested parties. All of the workshops will be recorded and accessible via our website. So now finally on to introductions. I'm Diane Kugel. Elaine Saul, who is also here this evening, and I supervise our 2 irrigated lands programs groups here in our office. This is the first of a series of workshops that we will be having to help growers navigate Ag Order 4.0. So this evening's workshop is not technical in nature. And by that, I mean that we won't be diving into the details on how to collect or report data. That's going to come in some future workshops. In addition, today's workshop will not be providing specific details about exactly how a third party will help growers comply with Ag Order 4.0. But what we can tell you about a third party at this time is that Matt Keeling, our executive officer, recently approved Central Coast Water Quality Preservation Inc., or Preservation Inc. for short, as the administrator of a region-wide third-party program that will assist participating members in complying with the order. So Preservation Inc. is going to be providing folks with information about membership, their services, and options for growers to access the various services at a later time. If you have any questions about what Preservation Inc. can do for you, please reach out to Preservation Inc.'s Executive Director, Sarah Lopez, or contact the Preservation Inc. support line. And this contact information for either of those is included in 2 upcoming slides. Please note that information from Preservation Inc. will be available in time for growers to decide on membership before our Water Board upcoming due date for updating growers' notices of intent on GeoTracker. And there'll be more in the presentation about that particular due date as we move forward through our presentations. Another item that I need to mention for you is that you may have heard that this order has been petitioned to the State Water Board, and that's true. But please note that all order requirements are in full effect throughout the petition process. So today our presentations will cover Ag Order 4.0 information and expectations for growers. And our presenters today are Lauren Gordon, Sarah Bragg-Flaben, and Jacqueline Tack. We also have Monica Baracarte on hand to help out. And in addition, Elaine Saul and I are also here to chime in with responses to questions if needed. So with that, let's get started with Lauren's portion of the workshop. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Diane. Good evening. My name is Lauren Gordon. I'm an engineering geologist here at the Water Board. Let's start off with logistics for our workshop today. The presentation is broken into 3 sections with a 10-minute break after the first section. The 3 sections that will be covered today are groundwater protection requirements, surface water requirements, and an overview of the requirements for the next 3 years. Question and answer sessions are in place after each section to give you an opportunity to ask questions on the subject. Please save your questions for one of the 3 Q&A sessions or write them in the chat box. During the Q&A session, please use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask a question or write your question in the chat box. We'll remind you of these instructions when we get to the Q&A opportunities. Before we dig into this workshop, I wanted to make you aware of some resources that may be helpful to you to get up to speed on this material and contacts that you have if you have any questions. On our website, you will find all of the important announcements and documents associated with Ag Order 4.0. There is a compliance calendar available on our website that provides due dates in a condensed spot and responses to frequently asked questions. You will also find a list of technical assistance providers and consultants, plus information about available third-party programs you can enroll in, Currently, Preservation Inc., as Diane mentioned, is the only approved one, but there may be more options in the future. Also, please don't hesitate to contact Irrigated Lands Program staff with questions. We are available by the Ag NOI email address on the screen or phone number. You can also find our individual contact information on the front page of our website. You'll see a link on the right-hand side of the page called Irrigated Lands Program Contacts, where you will find our direct contact information. So moving on to the summary of today's workshop, we will start with our goal for today. We will also go over the current water quality concerns in our region and the crossover with agricultural practices. We will spend the majority of our time discussing Ag Order 4.0 requirements and providing an overview of the monitoring and reporting aspect of the order. Additionally, we will provide some tools and resources that are available for growers. There will be 3 question and answer sessions throughout the presentation, and at the end of this presentation, there will be an interactive survey that you as the attendees can fill out. The intention of this survey is to gather feedback on what kind of technical presentations and resources would be helpful to you with regards to complying with Ag Order 4.0. We will be using the results of the survey to inform us of topics for future workshops, so they will be as useful as possible. In case you are not able to follow the adoption process, this presentation is geared towards people who are hearing this information for the first time. Today, we will cover the basics of Ag Order 4.0. We will provide a high-level overview of the order and its requirements, of which you'll need to comply with in the next few years. These requirements apply to growers whether they complete them individually or through a third-party program. We will provide an overview of the specific requirements due in the next 3 years. Please keep in mind that we will be providing follow-up workshops that are intended to go into more detail associated with the technical requirements of Ag Order 4.0. So what brings us here today? Growing crops is important, and the choices growers make can have significant impacts to water quality. We understand that the relationship between irrigation and nitrogen are essential to grow crops, and how these components are managed is critical to maintaining and improving water quality. Both irrigation runoff and stormwater runoff are important to monitor, as these are the main ways water contaminants leave farmland, either by infiltrating to groundwater or as runoff to surface water. In groundwater, based on data that shows continued worsening water quality conditions, we are concerned about nitrate and 1,2,3-trichloropropane, or TCP. We understand that 1,2,3-TCP is not commonly used in ag practices anymore. However, over the last few years, we have been collecting water quality data and have found 1,2,3-TCP in domestic wells, where we are also finding nitrate contamination. 1,2,3-TCP in drinking water is a public health concern that we need to assess. In surface water, we are also seeing worsening water quality conditions, as irrigation runoff and stormwater runoff both carry contaminants such as sediment, pesticides, and nitrogen into our surface water bodies. Both specific pesticides such as bifenthrin and increased toxicity to aquatic life have also been detected. There are water quality concerns that have been worsening and continue to over time. That is why this Ag Order is in place. Now we're going to go into the requirements in Ag Order 4.0. These are general requirements expected of growers enrolled in the Irrigated Lands Program. Hopefully, in reading the list of requirements that I'll have here, you will see that these are not new. You are already doing many of these things, so please continue to do so. Enrollment in the Ag Order with the Irrigated Lands Program is required for all operations irrigating and producing commercial crops, and should be done online through GeoTracker. Please contact us if you have questions about enrollment. Please update your electronic notice of intent, or ENOI, within 60 days of a change in ENOI information. Along these lines, there are some updates to the ENOI, form that growers are required to fill out by September 13th, 2021. This includes information regarding drinking water notifications, surface water bodies, slopes, and impermeable surfaces. Growers must pay annual permit fees. There is a significant fee break for enrollees in the third-party programs versus individual dischargers. This is an incentive to be enrolled in a third-party program. Additionally, growers are required to obtain water quality education in order to improve management practices and assess effectiveness, with the intent of changing practices based on water quality in their area. You do not need to report this information to the Water Board, but it is required. Continual improvement is the underlying basis of how we plan to improve water quality. Therefore, it is required to implement and assess effectiveness of management practices. This means if something is working, keep using it, and if something is not, stop and try something else. The Farm Plan and Annual Compliance Form, or ACF, are tools to implement and assess effectiveness of management practices. The farm plan is kept on the farm, and in Ag Order 4.0, there are specific sections which growers must have related to irrigation and nutrient management, pesticides management, and sediment management. Third-party programs may develop a template to assist their members with this requirement. As many growers completed in Ag Order 3.0, now all growers must submit an annual compliance form, or ACF, through GeoTracker. Here, growers report summary information on management practices, effectiveness assessments, and document changes in water quality conditions. Next, Sarah will be talking about additional requirements that are specific to groundwater protection.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bragg-Flavin, a Water Resource Control Engineer in the Irrigated Lands Program. I'm going to introduce the topics we're going to cover in this section. So in this section, I will first be sharing the incentives for growers to participate in the third-party Alternative Compliance Pathway Program, which may assist growers in complying with their groundwater protection requirements. Then we'll go over fertilizer nitrogen application targets and limits. These are crop-specific amounts of fertilizer nitrogen that growers need to work towards achieving. Before moving on, I want to cover what we mean by targets and limits. First, targets and limits are numeric requirements that have been adopted in Ag Order 4.0. Targets are not enforceable. And what this means is if a grower has difficulty achieving targets, we may require additional education, additional management practices, or the grower to have a consultant help them dial in their management practices. Limits are enforceable, and what this means is if a grower cannot achieve compliance, a grower may be facing enforcement. Next, we'll go over nitrogen discharge to groundwater targets and limits. These targets and limits are based on the nitrogen applied and nitrogen removed from a ranch. The intent of these targets and limits are to reduce the amount of nitrogen discharge from irrigated lands to groundwater. Then wrapping up, we have the groundwater protection requirement section. We will provide an overview of what growers have to monitor and what and when growers have to report to the Water Board. As shared, I'm providing an overview of these topics. The Water Board will be providing workshops that go into the details of these requirements in the near future. So before going into the requirements, I wanted to cover the incentives for growers to join the third-party Alternative Compliance Pathway Program, or 3P ACP program. Benefits of being a member of the program include having targets instead of limits. We'll be discussing the targets associated with the program in greater detail in later slides. Members have more time to comply with those targets, and members of the program are not subject to ranch-level groundwater discharge monitoring. We'll be covering this at the end of this section. The 3P ACP administrator will be reaching out to their members to give them more information. Again, please remember that we currently have one third-party administrator approved, Central Coast Water Quality Preservation, Inc. And if you're interested in joining them, you must enroll with them directly. Fertilizer nitrogen application targets and limits are new requirements in Ag Order 4.0. These are to reduce the over-application of fertilizer nitrogen above what crops use. 3P ACP program members have targets, and all other growers have limits. These are targets or limits of fertilizer nitrogen applied to a crop, which is why the units are pounds of nitrogen per crop acre. These targets or limits are above or within the California Department of Food and Agriculture, CDFA, Fertilizer Research and Education Program recommendations for nitrogen application for these crops. There are specific targets or limits for 6 crops and one for all other crops, Most ranches are already meeting these targets and limits. Remember, these targets and limits are intended to address a small subset of ranches or outliers over applying fertilizer nitrogen. This is the table of fertilizer nitrogen application targets and limits. Walking through the table, in the left-hand column of the table is the list of crops for which limits have been established, as well as the last row for all other crops. The middle column has limits that go into effect in 2023, and the final column shows limits that go into effect in 2025. These limits are a slight decrease from the 2023 limits. As an example, if I'm a grower and I'm growing a lettuce crop and a celery crop in 2023, I could apply 275 pounds of fertilizer nitrogen per acre to the lettuce crop and be in compliance. And then I can grow my second crop of celery, applying 360 pounds of fertilizer nitrogen per acre to the celery crop and be in compliance. Now remember, we introduced the benefits that members of the 3P ACP program have, including more time to meet their targets and having targets rather than limits. So this shows for members of the 3P ACP program, they would have to achieve their targets 1 year later than non-members. And remember that most ranches are already meeting these targets and limits. Now I'm going to be talking about nitrogen discharge to groundwater targets and limits. Again, the 3P ACP program members have the benefits of having nitrogen discharge targets. All other growers have targets and limits. What is nitrogen discharge? Nitrogen discharge is the nitrogen that's available to be discharged to groundwater from all crops grown on a ranch within the year. The units are pounds of nitrogen per ranch acre, and compliance is at the ranch level, not the crop level. The general equation for nitrogen discharge is nitrogen applied minus nitrogen removed. Nitrogen applied includes nitrogen in fertilizer, nitrogen in irrigation water, plus any other product applied that contains nitrogen. Nitrogen removed is mainly nitrogen removed when the crops are harvested. So now growers need to know how much they harvest and the concentration of nitrogen in the plant material that is removed. We have nitrogen concentration of plant material or nitrogen removal coefficients for many of the crops grown in the region. Also, some woody crops retain or sequester nitrogen in their trunks. This is considered nitrogen removed. There are also some other types of nitrogen removal, such as treatment systems, and an example of one would be a wood chip bioreactor. A little more on nitrogen removal coefficients. We have ongoing efforts to increase the number of crops for which we have nitrogen removal coefficients. We are working with CDFA, and it is our understanding within the year we'll have coefficients for an additional 20 crops. Also within the year, We will have the standard protocol for growers to develop their own coefficients. We are coordinating with CDFA and the University of California Cooperative Extension on this. To introduce the formulas, there are 3 formulas, or what in the order are called compliance pathways. Growers only have to comply by one formula or pathway. Based on growers' reported data, we will calculate nitrogen discharge. The table presented is the nitrogen discharge targets and limits. In the first column are simplified compliance pathway formulas. In the next column are the 2023 targets, then the 2025 targets. The next column presents the 2027 limits. The squiggly line between the 2027 limits and the 2051 limit is to represent that after 2027, there are 3 additional decreasing limits before a final nitrogen discharge limit in 2051. For the first compliance pathway shown in the table, the A is nitrogen applied, the R is nitrogen removed, and in this pathway, the nitrogen applied includes the nitrogen in irrigation water shown as A-IR. In the following 2 compliance pathways, the nitrogen in irrigation water is not included in the compliance pathway formulas. This is to incentivize the use of nitrogen in irrigation water. The targets and limits apply to all ranches and are not phased in. However, the monitoring and reporting to the water board of nitrogen discharge to groundwater is phased in. This means that growers have an opportunity to evaluate their ability to meet the targets and limits prior to reporting on it. For the first few years AgOrder 4.0 is in effect, all growers have targets, which are not enforceable. Looking at the first compliance pathway on the table, many, if not most growers are already achieving the 500 pounds of nitrogen per ranch acre target. Then beginning in 2027, growers complying individually must comply with limits, which are enforceable. Many growers are also meeting this limit. Some growers will have to adjust their management practices to better balance the nitrogen applied minus nitrogen removed to meet the first limit and subsequent limits. We recognize it takes time to change and dial in management practices. The targets and limits decrease over 30 years to the final limit of 50 pounds of nitrogen per ranch acre. The purpose of this reduction over time is to reduce nitrogen discharge and be protective of water quality. If a grower is a member of the third-party alternative compliance pathway program, then they have the benefits that we have covered of only having targets and having more time to comply. There is follow-up if a member of the program is unable to meet targets. The third party will be following up with them, and they may have additional requirements. Now in the last column, we have groundwater protection area targets instead of our previous individual limits. The work ahead for the third-party alternative compliance pathway program is to develop and then have approved by the executive officer the alternative area-specific targets for nitrogen discharge to groundwater on behalf of its members. The program will be developing work plans in a stepwise process that will yield the groundwater protection area targets. As the program members have the water board determined targets for the first few years that AgOrder 4.0 is in effect, the program needs to develop targets beginning after 2028 and that are protective of water quality. The program administrator will be providing more information to its members about this effort as their third-party program gets underway. Please remember that we will currently have one third-party administrator approved, Central Coast Water Quality Preservation, Inc. Now on to incentives for reducing nitrogen discharge built into AgOrder 4.0. The general nitrogen applied minus nitrogen removed equation equals nitrogen discharge is on the slide for reference. As previously mentioned, the way we're incentivizing the use of nitrogen in irrigation water is by not including it in 2 of the 3 compliance pathway formulas. Discounts apply solely to nitrogen applied. Discounts are available for the nitrogen applied in organic fertilizers and the nitrogen applied in compost. Credits apply to nitrogen removed, and these are received for specific management practices. Growers using the management practices of cover crops, high carbon amendments, and woody mulch may receive increased nitrogen removal or credits. Okay. And remember, we will be providing workshops covering nitrogen discharge to groundwater requirements, compliance pathways, targets, limits, incentives, and reporting in detail. I encourage you to attend. I'm going to hand it back over to Lauren to cover groundwater protection, monitoring, and reporting. We'll have time for questions after Lauren completes the remainder of the section. You are welcome to hold your questions until then or place them in the chat. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, now we will be going into the groundwater protection, monitoring, and reporting. This section includes all of the things that you're going to be needing to do in terms of monitoring and reporting to comply with the requirements in Ag Order 4.0. You'll need to conduct this monitoring for your own record keeping and farm management purposes, as well as to monitor water quality for human health considerations and to report data to the Water Board for compliance with Ag Order 4.0. In the next 2 slides, I will be discussing groundwater phase areas, which will help you determine the dates of which the monitoring and reporting requirements apply to your ranches, and when you'll need to begin this monitoring and reporting. We took a phased-in approach for some requirements to provide growers with time to get up to speed with the groundwater protection, monitoring, and reporting requirements. We defined 3 groundwater phase areas for our region that will be shown on a map in the following slide. The groundwater phase areas are assigned to individual ranches based on their location. Locations with the most impaired groundwater and highest recharge areas were prioritized as groundwater phase 1 areas. Groundwater phase 1 areas are going to have to report some information sooner than groundwater phase 2 or phase 3 areas. You may recall that ranches were tiered under Ag Order 3.0 to determine the monitoring and reporting requirements that apply to each enrolled ranch. This tiering assignment no longer applies under Ag Order 4.0. Now we have groundwater phase areas, and unlike the tiering, all growers eventually must comply with all requirements. If you're wondering how to find your ranch's groundwater phase area, this information is located on your ranch ENOI. You can view your ranch's groundwater phase area by logging into GeoTracker, then locating the ranch you'd like to review and clicking the Edit Ranch Info button. This will take you to your ranch ENOI, and you will find the groundwater phase area in the top right of the page, just like it's shown here on the slide. This is also where you can find your ranch's surface water priority area, which we'll be discussing after the break. Also, hopefully you received the email we sent you sharing the groundwater phase information for your ranches. So this map is to help you get an idea of where your ranch may fall into a groundwater phase area. The phase 1 areas are in the dark gray. The phase 2 areas are in the lighter gray. And finally, the phase 3 areas are all of the remaining non-shaded area of the map. The approximate basins and subbasins that fall into the respective groundwater phase areas are listed on the right for your reference. Please remember that your groundwater phase area is located on your ranch ENOI. Next, I'll be discussing the irrigation and nutrient management plan, monitoring and reporting requirement. Okay, now we're going to talk about the irrigation and nutrient management monitoring and reporting. In order to comply with the order's targets and limits and improve water quality, growers will have to collect and report specific measured, or in some cases, estimated information about their nutrient and irrigation management practices. On this slide, you'll see a list of the components that will need to be collected. Eventually, all growers in all groundwater phase areas will need to be collecting and reporting data on an annual basis of all nitrogen applied to the ranch, irrigation practices, and all nitrogen removed from the ranch. But we're phasing in when this needs to be tracked and reported. We'll show that in the next slide. The data that is collected under the total nitrogen applied umbrella, which is in the first column in this slide, would be used in the total nitrogen applied report that groundwater phase 2 and phase 3 area growers will be reporting until they are reporting this information in the Irrigation and Nutrient Management Plan, or INMP summary report, which you can see in the second column. Where you see the arrows in this slide, the nitrogen applied and irrigation information are the same information, with the exception that the irrigation information will be collected as estimated values in the TNA requirement and will be required to be measured once the grower is reporting in the INMP summary report. Estimated irrigation information is roughly calculated by whatever means the grower feels appropriate. Under the INMP summary report, the irrigation information must be measured with equipment that can provide an accurate value, such as a flow meter for irrigation water volume. Please note that the TNA report makes up the first section reported in the INMP. The additional pieces of information reported in the INMP summary report will be the nitrogen removed from the field. All of this information is being collected to assess how well the nutrient and irrigation management practices are performing to help growers achieve the discharge targets and limits. Now, this slide will show the timeline of the phasing in of these requirements. As we discussed earlier, each ranch has a designated groundwater phase area. So growers in groundwater phase 2 and phase 3 areas need to report only the TNA and some irrigation information for the first few years the order is in effect. This is reported in the standalone TNA report available on GeoTracker. For example, groundwater phase 2 area ranches will collect TNA information starting in 2023 and will be reported in the following year. Then, on a phased-in basis, they must add total nitrogen removed and additional irrigation information to their monitoring and reporting starting in 2025, which will be reported in the Irrigation and Nutrient Management Plan, or INMP summary report, the following year. The first stage, when only TNA and certain irrigation information is required, is reported in the total nitrogen applied, or TNA report, which is available on GeoTracker now. Coming back to groundwater phase 1 areas, due to the magnitude of groundwater impairment and recharge characteristics in groundwater phase 1 areas, growers with ranches in groundwater phase 1 areas must monitor and report all this required information, which includes nitrogen applied, nitrogen removed, and irrigation information before the ranches in the other phase areas. Just like the other phase areas, when all of the required information is reported, this will be done through the INMP summary report, which will be available on GeoTracker within the next few months. To reiterate, the TNA report makes up the first section of the INMP summary report. Growers who have been submitting total nitrogen applied reports under previous ag orders will continue to do so under the respective TNA INMP requirement once it goes into effect under Ag Order 4.0. Now we'll discuss on-farm domestic well monitoring and reporting. You can comply as an individual or through a third-party program. As an individual, the definition of an on-farm domestic well is a well that provides water for drinking and bathing and is installed on the property of an active farm. You will need to coordinate with laboratories directly to conduct sampling and analysis. An updated list of approved laboratories will be available on our website soon. For this monitoring and reporting requirement, all ranches will need to collect samples from all of their domestic wells on the farm property starting in 2022. The annual sampling will need to occur between March 1st and May 31st, and those results will need to be uploaded by the laboratory to GeoTracker by July 31st. This requirement is not phased in, but applies to all growers. Samples must be analyzed for nitrate and 1,2,3-trichloropropane, or TCP. This is a reduction in parameters compared to Ag Order 3.0. As we discussed in the earlier water quality conditions slide, 1,2,3-TCP was added because it was detected in domestic wells that were also detecting elevated nitrate. 1,2,3-TCP is a public health concern that we need to assess. Please note that monitoring for 1,2,3-TCP may be reduced and ended over time depending on whether it is detected in the well. We will be coordinating with laboratories to make sure they are prepared to conduct the analyses required for on-farm well sampling. Growers must provide well users and any new well users with a summary of the nitrate and 1,2,3-TCP results within 3 business days of receiving them from the laboratory. We call this the drinking water notification. Next, we will discuss the primary irrigation well monitoring. Okay, the main or primary irrigation well used on the ranch must be monitored for the first few years the order is in effect. Just like the on-farm domestic well monitoring requirement we just discussed, the primary irrigation well will need to be monitored annually starting in 2022. Please keep in mind that this monitoring will only be required until trend monitoring begins. The purpose of this requirement is to evaluate groundwater conditions in agricultural areas and to inform the establishment of a groundwater quality trend monitoring network that is representative of the groundwater in the Central Coast region. In the years where sampling of the primary irrigation well is required, in lieu of the groundwater quality trend monitoring, annual sampling and reporting is to occur during the same time periods as the on-farm domestic well sampling. The primary irrigation well is to be analyzed for nitrogen and total dissolved solids, or TDS. Please note that this is a reduction of parameters from what was required in Ag Order 3.0. Groundwater quality trend monitoring is intended to determine if water quality is improving, maintaining, or degrading over time in agricultural areas. All growers have the option to comply with this requirement individually or as a third-party member. The key thing to note here is if you're a member of a third party, the third party will prepare, submit, and carry out the work plan, including sampling, data reporting, and trend evaluation. If you are not a third party member, you as an individual grower must conduct all these actions on your own. The first step in complying with this requirement is the development of a trend monitoring work plan. Whether you're complying as an individual or as a third-party member, a work plan will need to be submitted detailing how groundwater quality trend monitoring will occur. One of the main components of the work plan is a defined trend monitoring well network. That includes wells that may be existing or newly installed. The work plan must be developed and submitted by the following dates. For groundwater phase 1 areas, the work plan must be submitted by September 1st, 2023. For groundwater phase 2 areas, that must be done by September 1st, 2025. And for groundwater phase 3 areas, it must be done by September 1st, 2027. Well sampling and reporting is required on a semi-annual basis for growers not in a third-party program. If you are a member of a third-party program, monitoring and reporting must occur with the executive officer approved schedule contained in the third-party trend monitoring work plan. In either case, a groundwater quality trend evaluation report must be submitted to the Water Board. Remember that for the individual option, annual trend reports are required. For the third-party option, the schedule for a trend evaluation reporting will be determined in the executive officer approved work plan. Now we will discuss ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring. If a grower repeatedly does not meet the nitrogen discharge targets or limits, they may be subject to ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring. This is not required of every grower, but at the discretion of the executive officer. This means monitoring of discharge to groundwater would be monitored and reported at a ranch level by the individual grower rather than at a regional level. Ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring may be required as a consequence for significant and repeated exceedance of nitrogen discharge targets or limits. This requirement this is not only a consequence, but in place to help growers dial in their management practices to further reduce nitrogen discharge by reducing application from fertilizers and irrigation water to meet targets and limits. This type of monitoring could be achieved by utilizing tools such as lysimeters for monitoring at or below the root zone. Lysimeters are only one example of techniques that could be used to achieve this monitoring. Please note that this level of monitoring may be discontinued after targets or limits are met. Also keep in mind, if you're a member of the third-party alternative compliance pathway, or 3P ACP that Sarah had discussed earlier, this requirement does not apply to you. To sum things up, here are some important takeaways regarding the groundwater protection requirements. As we discussed previously, there is currently one approved third-party program available to assist you with compliance of Ag Order 4.0. If you would like to be enrolled with a third party, you will need to enroll with them directly. Many growers have previously reported on similar requirements seen in the first few years of the order. Starting next year, some are phased in after that. The intent of phasing is to allow time for growers to be able to comply with the requirements. Generally, make sure to gain familiarity with the monitoring and reporting requirements in Ag Order 4.0. You'll begin record keeping and collecting data for nitrogen application reporting within the next couple of years. As we discussed in this order, there are fertilizer nitrogen application targets or limits. You'll need to collect total nitrogen applied information. How and when this information is reported is dependent on your ranch's groundwater phase area. Nitrogen removed, data collection and reporting for the I&P summary report is phased in by groundwater phase area. There are nitrogen discharge targets and limits that need to be met over time. Meeting these targets and limits is assessed by the information you report in your I&P summary report. All domestic wells and the primary irrigation well on all enrolled ranches will need to be sampled annually. Primary irrigation well sampling will occur annually until groundwater quality trend monitoring begins based on groundwater phase area. Groundwater trend monitoring may be done as an individual or through a third party. If you are reporting as an individual, you will need to submit a work plan for water board approval. Ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring may be required as a consequence and tool to assist growers with achieving groundwater discharge targets and limits. Now we are open for questions on this portion of the presentation. Just a reminder that this workshop is meant to be a high-level overview of the requirements, and there will be future workshops focused on specifics of monitoring and reporting requirements. Please use the raise hand feature to ask your question, and we will call on you one at a time by your name or phone number. You may also type your question in the chat. If you are calling in and you have a question, please press *9 to raise your hand. And when your name or number is called, please press *6 to unmute or mute. Now we'll take your questions.
Hi, we have one question by raised hand. I'm gonna, sorry if I mispronounce your name, Suryab. Hi, I'm gonna ask you to unmute if you'd like.
Hey, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Very interesting presentation. And sorry, I don't have a question. Can you go back one slide, please? I missed some part of it. My internet was really bad. I'm sorry about that.
We're actually going to put this presentation on our website if you'd like to download it. Is there any specific question you had on the dates?
No. So I just wanted to know, when you contact a third party person for this particular monitoring and reporting, is there a particular format that will be recommended, or like how would it go on from there?
So we do have a format for a variety of reports, and they're done through an online database called GeoTracker. And we will we'll be providing additional workshops on reporting and get into those. You're also welcome to call us or email us any questions, and we can meet with you individually to help you with enrollment or reporting.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's no other raised hands, so we're going to go start questions in the chat. Starting kind of from the beginning. So from Amy, is this presentation available for sorry, Diane already answered that question, so I'll not waste time going over that again. Going to Lori's question, why not go after the ranches that are not meeting the limits? Lori, thank you for your question. I'm understanding this question to mean the fertilizer nitrogen application targets and limits. Our intent is to work with growers that are unable to meet those targets and limits and help them achieve compliance. And that's the intent of those. We'll also continue to have workshops for growers. If Elaine or Diane has any additional comments on that, please.
Thank you. I'll just add that, you know, it is our intention to work with growers that are not able, like what Sarah said, to meet those fertilizer nitrogen application limits. Meeting those fertilizer nitrogen application limits are going to be very important for growers then to be able to go on and meet the nitrogen discharge targets and limits. So if a grower is not able to meet those crop specific limits or the other limit for the fertilizer nitrogen applied, there are some follow-up actions that could occur. You know, we may ask a grower to obtain additional education and outreach, and maybe perhaps even implement some additional management practices. So again, we will be following up and focusing on those growers that are not able to meet those targets and limits.
Okay. Going on to the next question from Amy. Can you explain whether AIR includes nitrogen naturally in the irrigation water only? So yes, thanks for your question. That's our intent with AIR, is that it's the nitrogen that when you're pumping water directly in that water before any fertigation or nitrogen's added to the water, that's the nitrogen that we're counting in AIR. The fertilizer, if you do fertigation, that would be accounted for in your calculations for fertilizer applied. Okay. On to a question from Kay. How can the Water Board justify negatively mining soil to the 2051 limit for the pathway number 3? I'm not going to read the rest of the comment, but I'll work to answering that question. Okay, thanks for your question. We didn't present the compliance pathways for nitrogen discharge to groundwater. There are many components in them, and for the development of pathway 3, the components in it differ from pathway 1 such that to protect water quality, it has a negative value in the 2051 limit. We will be going into detail of these equations and when they may be beneficial to use for growers to use one compliance pathway over another in the future workshops. And Elaine or Diane, if you'd like to add any other comments.
Not me.
Okay. Next question is from Mike. Can growers who use a nitrogen harvesting cover crop get credit for removal, in addition, removal by harvested crop? Mike, I'm understanding your question to mean that could they get, I'm trying to work out. So for nitrogen removal in nitrogen discharge to groundwater, growers can choose between harvesting a cover crop and accounting for the nitrogen removed by that pathway, or they can get credit for the management practices of using a cover crop and they don't have to harvest it in that pathway. If I misinterpreted your question, go ahead and respond in the chat or raise your hand.
And I think, Sarah, just to add here, related to a response to this, is that if a grower is claiming the credit for a cover crop that they have implemented as a management practices, you cannot claim the cover crop credit as well as claim the nitrogen removal when you harvest that cover crop. You can only use one or the other, meaning you claim the credit and you can claim the nitrogen removal via the credit for that cover crop, but you would not be able to do it for the other portion of the calculation for actual harvest removal of that cover crop.
Okay. So moving on to Nathan's question, is there accommodations for crop failures, or will a failure also result in non-compliance? So Nathan, we definitely plan on working with growers to understand why they're not being able to meet targets or limits for both the specifically with the nitrogen discharge, because that deals with that removal component. Yes, we will work and understand if there's a crop failure, something that led to that inability to meet a target or limit. And then Lane, jump in if there's additional detail you'd like to add. Okay,
No.
moving then on to Kay's next question. When you refer to measured irrigation information, are you referring to water applied by the ranch? And the second part, do the measurement requirements apply to the water applied by crop? What about ET? So when we're talking about the INMP summary report, in that report, growers are required to report measured irrigation volumes by the ranch, and then estimated irrigation information to the crop, including ET or through ET. Trying to think if there's more additional comments needed to answer that. But also, this will be exactly what we're going into in the detail in the upcoming workshops on the INMP summary report, to help growers to understand where they can get the information and help them be able to report. Okay. Anyone of our team can jump in and add more detail. So the next one is from Anne. It appears that you have shaded the Paso Robles subbasin indicating groundwater phase 2. The farms we operate in that basin has virtually no measurable nitrogen in the groundwater. Can we petition to be phase 3?
I can jump in here. Yeah, thanks again for your question. So in our order, there is a table C.1-1, which lists all of the groundwater basins and subbasins and their groundwater phase area. And the Paso Robles subbasin would fall under actually groundwater phase 3 area. It would come under all other basins and areas outside of basins. So I believe you already are in groundwater phase area 3, although the best way to check is to see your ENOI, your notice of intent, to see what has been labeled there as far as your groundwater phase area.
Okay. As a time check, I think we have a few minutes left for to answer a few more questions. Sorry, I lost my spot here. Another question from Kay. What do you mean by a summary of results? Should be provided to a water consumer? A summary of sample for the year or a summary of all samples taken in the previous years?
So as far as the summary of those results, because they need to be provided to the resident within 3 business days of receiving the results, I mean, you could provide a summary with previous results that you've gotten, but generally we just require that the results that were taken most recently within that 3-day period or received within that 3-day period be provided to the resident.
Right, so it would be for that one particular year, the sampling results for that one annual sample.
Going through. Okay, the next question's from Sue. Sampling for the domestic well should occur after existing treatment filtration system rather than at the wellhead, correct? In other words, sampling should reflect the quality of the water that's actually being consumed?
Actually, that's incorrect. The sample should be collected at the wellhead or as close to the wellhead as possible before it goes through treatment.
Okay. Getting to a few more questions here. From Michelle, received an email reminding us that the ENOI needs to be reviewed and updated by September 13th, 2021. It mentions that the drinking water questions. If I understood correctly, the sampling is not required until spring 2022. How are we supposed to respond to these questions in the meantime?
Diane, do you mind answering this question?
Sure. So on the NOI section Roman numeral 11, groundwater monitoring and reporting for drinking water notification, if you don't have wells on your property, you can put in zeros. And that means that it may be appropriate for this particular update that's required this year to answer no or non-applicable for the fourth of those 4 questions associated with drinking water notification confirmation. And you're correct that the sampling doesn't begin until 2022.
Okay, we have only one final question in the chat. Oh, and we just had a hand raised, so. Alan asked.
Sarah, I think we're gonna just need one more question and then we're going to have to go to our break, if you don't mind.
Okay. So I started this one. So from Alan, the meeting is being recorded. Is it okay for us to get the link so we can share it with our employee? Yes, of course. It will take us a little bit of time to get these recordings posted to our website. We have time for Alan's last question. He raised his hand also. Okay, I'm going to ask you to unmute, Alan.
So it's actually related to my recording question. So how do we get the link? Do we submit the email or how do I get basically how do I get the link to the recording once you have it?
You won't necessarily need a link. It'll be posted on our water board website. So anybody can go there and view the recorded videos. So we'll communicate when they've been posted is, I guess, my understanding.
Right, we'll get the word out to folks when those are available to be accessed. In the meantime, if you want to check our website just to see if it's there or not, you know, that's certainly something you could do as well, and we'll try and get them up there as fast as possible. Okay, so now it's time for a break. And we're factoring in about a 10-minute break. So that means if folks could get back by, let's say 7:15, and we'll resume with some of our surface water requirements and take it from there. So thanks, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Jacqueline Tack, and today during this portion of the presentation, I will be providing you all with an overview of Ag Order 4.0 surface water protection requirements. These requirements include the surface receiving water limits, such as those for nutrients, pesticides, and sediment. These limits apply to what we call the surface receiving waters in our region, which include, for example, our creeks and our streams. After I discuss the surface receiving water limits, I will then go over our surface water monitoring and reporting requirements. I'll start with an overview of surface water quality trend monitoring. Then moving on, we'll discuss follow-up surface receiving water implementation, and I will finish the surface water protection portion of this presentation by going over the potential for ranch level surface discharge monitoring and reporting. So Ag Order 4.0 establishes surface receiving water limits for nutrients such as nitrate, pesticides and toxicity, and turbidity and sediment. The first limit must be met in year 2032, and then the timeline continues, and due dates depend on the watershed that a ranch is located in. So now that 4.0 is in effect, growers and the third-party program have about 10 years to find solutions, adjust, and adapt to meet the first surface receiving water limits on time. Water board staff or the third-party program will be contacting growers to let them know which limits and timelines apply to the watershed where the ranches are located in. We also anticipate having interactive tools on our website so that anyone can see which limits apply to their watersheds of interest. As a quick overview, Ag Order 4.0 includes 3 types of surface water monitoring and reporting requirements, and I will be going over these in more detail in future slides. These requirements include surface receiving water quality trends that occurs at the receiving water level in our creeks and our streams, follow-up surface receiving water implementation that also occurs in our creeks and our streams and begins based on a ranch's location and surface water priority area designation. And last, ranch level surface discharge monitoring and reporting that occurs at the edge of field and may be required on a case-by-case basis. Like I said, I will be going into more detail on each of these monitoring and reporting types in the next few slides. And as I do, please keep in mind that all of these requirements can be completed by a third-party program on behalf of their member growers. So Ag Order 4.0 continues the surface receiving water quality trends monitoring in our region's receiving waters that occurred under previous Ag Orders. Currently, Central Coast Water Quality Preservation Inc.'s cooperative monitoring program completes this for most growers. And as was stated earlier, they are an approved third-party program and will continue to complete this requirement for their member growers under Ag Order 4.0. This requirement includes submitting a work plan by July 1st, 2022 that in general identifies monitoring locations, what will be monitored, and a schedule. The data from this monitoring will be used to help assess the impact agriculture has on water quality. This is important because it will show where progress is being made to meet limits and where extra assistance may be needed before compliance dates. All of this is summarized every year and submitted electronically to us as an annual report. And again, if growers are members of the third-party program, then all of this will be taken care of on their behalf. Ag Order 4.0 introduces follow-up monitoring and reporting requirements, which are still focused on surface receiving waters in our creeks and our streams. Essentially, this follow-up requires developing a work plan that informs growers of water quality in the watersheds where their ranches are located and identifies actions needed to achieve and maintain compliance with limits. Ranches are assigned a surface water priority area based on their location. For growers who are not members of the third-party program and choose to develop their own follow-up implementation work plan, their ranches are assigned a priority area of 1, 2, 3, or 4. For growers that are members of the third-party program, their ranches are assigned a priority area of high, medium, or low. These priority areas are displayed on each ranch ENOI. An example is pictured here on the bottom right portion of the screen within the red circle. For growers that are not third-party program members, the work plan due dates are staggered by year beginning in 2023, with ranches located in surface water priority area 1. For growers that are participating in the third-party program, the work plan due dates are staggered by every 2 years, beginning in year 2024 with ranches in high priority areas. Some of the expectations for this work plan include identifying additional monitoring locations to assess whether water quality is getting better or worse, and what can be done to improve or continue protecting water quality. In areas with water quality impairments, work plans will focus on identifying the sources of pollutants and how to prevent them from continuing. This could include things such as implementing additional management practices or adapting management practices that are currently being used based on water quality in their area. In these work plans, growers must demonstrate how progress is being made to reduce the pollutants that are identified in their area. Areas that are already meeting surface water limits, those work plans will be focusing on maintaining water quality and understanding and identifying what is working to achieve this. Every year, an annual report must be submitted to us that generally summarizes any additional monitoring data, describes what management practices or other follow-up activities that they are doing to demonstrate what has been done to restore or protect water quality and whether it was helpful to meet limits. And again, the third-party program will work with their members to complete this. Now I will discuss the potential requirement for ranch level surface discharge monitoring and reporting. This edge of field monitoring may be required as a consequence in a couple of instances. The first potential instance would be for growers that are not members of the third-party program who have persistent surface receiving water quality issues where their ranches are located. For example, if a ranch is in an area where the nitrate concentration in their nearby stream continues to get worse, and the grower has made minimal effort to implement management practices or to obtain relevant education, we would definitely take all of this into account when determining if a grower would be required to conduct edge of field monitoring. The second potential instance would be for any growers with ranches located in areas where surface water limits were not being met on time. And again, this would be determined on a case-by-case basis. Let's say, for example, a pesticide limit was the only limit not being met in a nearby stream, then a grower who doesn't use pesticides on their ranch wouldn't be required to conduct edge of field monitoring. I also want to reiterate that in this case, these growers in the third-party program wouldn't potentially be required to do this until after the first year limits apply in 2032. Water board staff will provide advance notice to growers and coordinate prior to requiring this edge of field monitoring. And if it is required, staff or the third-party program will work with the grower to develop a work plan and determine what needs to be monitored, the frequency, and the duration. The goal of this requirement is to work with growers and use the edge of field monitoring results to determine how individual ranches are impacting water quality and to let us know what needs to be done to ensure the surface water limits are met. This ranch level discharge monitoring and reporting may be discontinued once limits stopped. Now I will go over some important takeaways from the surface water protection portion of the presentation. First, the third-party program will be available to assist growers with these requirements. And of course, water board staff are also available to help. Next, remember we talked about the surface water limits. They have timelines associated with them, with the first being in 2032 and others coming in after that. Water board staff or the third-party program will let growers know well in advance of compliance stage which limits and timelines apply to the watersheds where their ranches are located. Ag Order 4.0 also continues the requirement for surface water quality trends monitoring and reporting. We will use this information to evaluate where, for example, nutrient, pesticide, or sediment problems persist, and to help inform the development of follow-up implementation work plans. These follow-up implementation work plans are watershed specific and will be developed based on a ranch's priority area to help growers achieve limits by their compliance dates and to maintain water quality thereafter. Last, branch level surface discharge monitoring will only be required as a consequence when growers that are not members of the third-party program are not making adequate progress to meet surface receiving water limits, or when any grower, third-party program members or not, have a ranch located in an area where a limit has not been met by its compliance date. Now we are open for questions on this portion of the presentation. And just a reminder that this workshop is meant to be a high-level overview of the requirements, and that there will be future workshops focused on the specifics of monitoring and reporting requirements. At this time, please use the raise hand features to ask your question, or feel free to type them in the chat. If you are calling into this meeting, please press *9 to raise your hand, and then when you are called on, press *6 to mute or unmute yourself.
Okay, we have a raised hand from Sarah Lopez. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Oops.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, I wanted to ask if you could expand on the statement that water quality is getting worse.
So I can expand on that statement, Sarah, and I believe what you're referring to is the statement that was made during Lauren's presentation about the introduction related to our water quality concerns. And I do note also your comments as well as Kay Mercer's about that is perhaps an inaccurate statement. And related to surface water, yes, that's true. There are areas in the region where water quality in agricultural areas are still impaired and perhaps worsening, but there are other areas in agriculture areas where water quality is maintaining. Perhaps in some areas it's improving, but not improving to the extent that we are close to meeting our water quality objectives or protecting beneficial uses.
Okay.
Thank you for the question and the clarification. Okay.
Thanks, Elaine.
So we're prioritizing questions on the surface water protection requirements. If we don't have any, Diane, do you mind if we respond to Michelle's question?
Oh, not at all.
The chat.
Go ahead.
Okay. Michelle asked a question. You mentioned that eventually there will be a requirement to measure irrigation water with a flow meter. What are your expectations for multiple use well, i.e. irrigation, stock watering, dust control? I will go ahead and work at answering your question, Michelle, and if I don't completely answer it, Elaine or Diane, if you could chime in. With the INMP summary reporting, there is the expectation that at the ranch level, we would have a measured irrigation water. With wells that have multiple use, some of that may go to different sources, and that would be up to the grower to be able to calculate and account for the differences, say, for stock watering. So that's kind of, and we'll provide more information, I guess, on the workshops and address those questions. These are great for the specific workshops on INMP, summary reporting, and we can get into the details. Okay. From Anne, how often will you calibrate flow meters? And thank you for your question. I think it's very helpful to hear these. I'm not prepared to really answer that one at this time, but I think we can cover that in the workshop specific for the INMP summary reporting. Elaine or Paula or Monica, Lina or Diane, if you would like to provide any additional details.
I don't have any specific details to provide at this point in time. But, in terms of calibration, I guess the one thing I will say at this point is, whoever you're going to be purchasing flow meters from, they'll have information associated with calibration that come along with it. But beyond that, I don't have any more details right now, but, we will have more details when we actually get to the instructional workshop for the irrigation and nutrient management part of our requirements. One more question came in from the chat.
Sorry. So we had a question from Lisa. Sorry, I did not catch the screen showing the surface water, or sorry, I'm not following the acronym. Surface receiving water quality limits.
Right. Thanks, Lisa. I actually did not show a slide displaying the surface receiving water quality limits. So you didn't miss it. That is a pretty long list, and it is watershed specific to a certain extent. And I would be more than happy to walk you through which limits apply to your ranches. If you want to reach out outside of this meeting, we can go over that. But I didn't show a slide with those surface receiving water quality limits.
But something, Jacqueline, that you did mention is that we do anticipate letting growers know which surface receiving water limits do apply to them in their area. And we're also looking to having some type of interactive tools available on our website. Those are things to come in the future, tools that will let you know which limits apply to you in your area.
Well, if there are no other questions, let's move on to the next phase of the presentation.
Great. So as a closing, I am going to briefly go over the requirements that are coming up in the next 3 years. So this year, year 2021, all growers are required to update their operation and ranch enrollment forms called ENOIs on GeoTracker by September 13th. Also remember that as any changes occur, the ENOI must be updated within 60 days. For example, some things that you may need to update within 60 days of a change include the responsible party's contact information, ranch contact information, perhaps acreage, or if the number of domestic wells or irrigation wells on the ranch change, that would be an update that would need to be made on the ENOI. It's really important for growers to keep their ENOIs updated because we rely on the contact information when we send notification emails, such as for upcoming requirements. Additionally, each year, growers must pay annual permit fees, which most of you have already done this year. And here it is important to note that third-party program members receive a reduced annual permit fee. As Sarah and Lauren discussed earlier, growers required under Ag Order 3.0 to submit total nitrogen applied data called the TNA report must continue to maintain records and submit their TNA report on GeoTracker by March 1st every year until the Irrigation and Nutrient Management Plan Summary Report or INMP Summary Report requirement is phased in for their ranches. All right, so year 2022, again, every year growers are required to pay their annual permit fees, still keeping in mind that third-party program members receive a reduced annual permit fee. Every year starting in 2022, all growers are required to submit the annual compliance form on GeoTracker. The annual compliance form, or ACF, includes information on farm plan development and implementation, such as what management practices are being implemented on their ranch. Also starting in 2022, like Lauren mentioned, all growers will be required to sample all of their on-farm domestic wells between March 1st and May 31st and report that information on GeoTracker by July 31st annually. These annual requirements that I just mentioned will keep applying each year, but won't be shown on future slides for years 2023 and year 2024. I will remind you though that they still do apply. For new requirements in 2022, all ranches must sample their primary irrigation well between March 1st and May 31st and report that information by July 31st every year until the groundwater trend monitoring requirement starts. By July 1st, 2022, all growers must submit their surface receiving water quality trends work plan, or this will be submitted by the third-party program on their behalf, on behalf of their members, excuse me. Lastly, growers required to submit TNA reporting during Ag Order 3.0 must continue to maintain records and to submit their TNA report in GeoTracker by March 1st every year until they are required to submit the INMP summary report. All right, so remember here for year 2023, the same annual requirements that I mentioned on the previous slides apply, which include the requirements to pay annual permit fees, submit the annual compliance form, and to sample and report data for all on-farm domestic wells. For the new requirements that are shown here, you'll see that again, all ranches must sample their primary irrigation well and report that data on GeoTracker. This is also the first year when growers who are not members of the third-party alternative compliance pathway must comply with the fertilizer nitrogen application limits, which remember are enforceable, and they must also comply with the first nitrogen discharge target, which is not enforceable. As Lauren and Sarah stated earlier, the fertilizer nitrogen application limits are within the CDFA guidelines, and the nitrogen discharge target has 3 compliance pathway options. For ranches required to submit TNA under Ag Order 3.0, 2023 is the last year where that requirement carries over as we transition to groundwater phase areas. Now, all ranches in groundwater phase 2 and phase 3 areas must maintain records to submit their TNA report in year 2024. All ranches in groundwater phase 1 areas must begin to maintain records to submit their INMP summary report in year 2024, which includes nitrogen removal and more in-depth irrigation water information. And remember, the records collected and maintained during a calendar year are reported March 1st of the following year. Also in 2023, all ranches located in groundwater phase 1 must submit their groundwater trend monitoring work plan by September 1st. And lastly, growers that are not part of the third-party program with ranches located in surface water priority area 1 will have to submit their fall implementation work plan by March 1st. Moving on to year 2024, the same annual requirements that I mentioned previously still apply, but are not shown here. Shown here in 2024, all ranches must sample their primary irrigation well and report that data on GeoTracker. Growers that are not members of the third-party alternative compliance pathway must continue to comply with the first fertilizer nitrogen application limits and the first nitrogen discharge target. And this year, growers that are members of the third-party alternative compliance pathway must comply with the first fertilizer nitrogen application targets, and they must also comply with the first nitrogen discharge target. And remember, targets are not enforceable. Ranches in groundwater phase 1 areas must submit their INMP summary report by March 1st and continue to maintain their INMP records. Ranches in groundwater phases 2 and 3 areas will submit their TNA reports by March 1st and continue to maintain records needed to submit their TNA report until the INMP summary report requirement begins. Growers that are not part of the third-party program with ranches located in surface water priority area 2 must submit their follow-up implementation work plans by March 1st, 2024. And growers that are part of the third-party program with ranches in high priority areas will have their follow-up implementation work plan submitted for them by March 1st, 2024. So now that we have provided an overview of the Ag Order 4.0 requirements and what the next 3 years will look like, I do want to highlight some of the resources that are currently available on our Irrigated Lands program website. Our website is where we have important announcements and documents, including a compliance calendar that outlines requirements and their due dates, responses to frequently asked questions, a list of technical assistance providers and consultants, our program's individual staff contact information listed out by their focus area, and a link and contact information for the approved third-party program administrator, Preservation Inc. General inquiries can be made by contacting the Irrigated Lands Program Ag NOI email or by phone. Both are shown here on the slide. We are also working to develop some additional resources, such as the drinking water notification template for growers to provide to all domestic well users within 3 business days of receiving sampling results, a template and instructions for the individual groundwater trend monitoring work plan, report instructions for the ACF, TNA, and INMP summary reports, and information about nitrogen removal coefficients, including CDFA's development of additional crop-specific values and our work with CDFA and the UC Cooperative Extension to develop standard protocols for growers who want to determine their own crop-specific values, which will be available by April in 2022. As for future workshops, the third-party program will be holding informational workshops in the future to let growers know about the services that they provide to help growers comply with our groundwater and surface water requirements. We also intend to hold workshops for growers on the TNA report, the INMP summary report, and then separate workshops for technical assistance providers. Also, in just a moment, we will be finishing this presentation with a real quick survey to find out what future workshops that you all would like us to hold. All right, so before the survey, if anyone has any questions on this portion of the presentation, please feel free, you can raise your hand or type your questions into the chat now. If you are calling into this meeting, please press *9 to raise your hand. And then when you are called on, press *6 to mute or unmute yourself. Again, as a quick reminder, this presentation is meant to be a big picture overview of Ag Order 4.0's requirements and the tools that are available for growers, and that more tools and workshops will be developed by us and the third-party program in the future.
So we have some questions in the chat. From Kay, after you have developed the R coefficients, will the Water Board provide grants to UCCE or other researchers to develop ET crop coefficients? Hi, Kay. Elaine, do you want to take this one or?
Yes, I'll go ahead and take this. What I can say is that, funding opportunities from the Water Board are limited. However, our executive officer, Matt Keeling, he has made a commitment to try and work with not only our agency, the State Water Resources Control Board, Central Coast Region, but also other agencies to identify where funding sources are available, where we can create partnerships to support the University Cooperative Extension to do additional research, such as what you mentioned, Kay, for the not only the coefficients, but also for crop ET.
Okay. Moving on to Pam's three-part question. Will the third party continue to monitor receiving water at the current CMP sites, regardless of whether growers in that sub-watershed are in the third party program? Second part, will the third party continue to do a trend analysis of these sites as currently? Will individual growers not joining the third party have access to these monitoring results? And will they be required to do their own trend analysis?
So the third party, I'm understanding the question to ask if the third party, as in Central Coast Water Quality Preservation, Inc., will continue to monitor the receiving water at the current CMP sites under the surface water quality trends monitoring and reporting requirements. And right now, we do have a predetermined set of monitoring locations that are required to be monitored under, that are listed in our order under our surface receiving water quality trends monitoring and reporting requirements. And the third party will be continuing to do that monitoring and reporting under the surface receiving water quality trends requirements. And the second part of the question, will the third party continue to do a trend analysis of these sites as currently? Because that is a requirement, the answer is yes. And will the individual growers not joining the third party have access to these monitoring results? And will they be required to do their own trend analysis? So without getting too much into the details of what the requirements are, they are required to upload the monitoring results to our California Environmental Data Exchange Network, also known as CDN, which is publicly available information. Although, because the surface receiving water quality trends monitoring and reporting requirements can be completed individually or through a third party, if a grower does decide to complete these requirements outside of the third party program, they would also be required to do monitoring in their near surface receiving water body and submit to us their trend analysis. But to answer your question, yes, the individual growers would have access to the CMP's data after it is downloaded from CDN, but there might be a time lapse. But if Elaine or Diane has anything to add to that.
No, I think Jacqueline, you're spot on. Other than maybe I'll just add that if growers are not members of a third-party program that is conducting this surface receiving water trends monitoring on their behalf, those individual growers will need to conduct individual surface receiving water trend monitoring, as Jacqueline mentioned, and complete these requirements individually. And it will be at a substantial cost to those individual growers to do this similar surface receiving water monitoring in their nearest creek, river, or stream, as well as to upload the data in the appropriate format to the database that Jacqueline mentioned, as well as to complete that trend analysis and submit an annual report to the Water Board. So we will be following up for those growers that do choose individual.
We have a question from John. How is enrollment with the third party handled? The enrollment link on Preservation Inc.'s website takes me to the Water Board site for ENOI. What is the expected cost model for a third party monitoring and support?
So I can jump in again here, Sarah, unless someone else also wants to respond. So if you are interested in joining the third-party program, the one that is currently approved with Preservation Inc., you will need to enroll with them directly. So you would need to contact Preservation Inc. Via the phone number or the email that we've provided as part of this presentation. Also available on Preservation Inc.'s website. Enroll with them directly. Preservation Inc., it's been indicated to us at the Water Board that they will be reaching out to growers in the coming days, weeks, to provide more information on the services and the costs related to third-party program enrollment. So at this time, we don't have any cost information, but again, the third-party program, Preservation Inc. will be reaching out to growers in the near future.
All right, if there are no other questions at this time, perhaps we can move on to the last phase of this presentation, which is the survey. Sarah, take it away.
Okay. Let me get to where I need to go. So lastly, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a bit more of your time to answer a few quick survey questions. If you're unable to take this survey now, please note that we still welcome your feedback. The survey questions will be on our website and you can email your responses or call us with your responses. There are 4 questions total, and we plan on using your answers as a guide for areas we focus on in developing guidance workshops for growers in the future. I will be reading the survey questions on the poll, and after the poll, I will share the results. If you're attending the workshop on the phone and unable to participate directly, again, we welcome your responses. Our email's on the slide, or you can email us or call us again. Okay, I'm going to launch the poll and begin reading the questions. So you should be able to see the poll now, beginning with question number 1. How did you hear about this workshop? There's 5 options to choose from. You can just select one from that question. Question number 2. Which areas of Ag Order 4.0 would you like more workshops, tools, or information on? You may select multiple responses for this question. If you would like information on all of the options, option 8 is all of the above. If you would like information on a topic not listed, there is an other category. And please provide comments in the chat of what you would like more information on. Question number 3. Was the virtual format of this workshop effective? And then question number 4, what is your preference for the format of future workshops? There's 5 options to choose from. We'll give a few minutes for people to be able to go through the survey. So responses continue to come in. We have approximately 65% of people have voted. Thank you to those who have put their other topics in the chat. Okay, we haven't really changed on the amount of the people have voted, and we'll give it about 15 more seconds to allow people to finish if they're interested. Okay, I'm going to share the results. You're seeing this at the same time we are, so we find this information useful in how we communicate with growers with questions, especially question 1, and then where people would like more information and were we effective in communication with this workshop. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close the workshop now. Okay. So as stated before, if you would like more assistance, please call us or email us. Our program contact information is here on the screen, and one of the irrigated land staff will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you for your time, and especially in the late evening. We are continuing this series of workshops. They will cover the same information. Tomorrow we have a Spanish workshop from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. and our last English presentation next Monday, July 26th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Repeating one last time, if you have any last questions or any additional questions, please email or call us and we'll get back to you.
Thank you for your time, everyone.